A spring afternoon in a Toronto schoolyard. These boys don't know it, but they're playing on top of a piece of history. Just a few months before, this same schoolyard looked very different. That's because the schoolyard had been transformed into the site of an archaeological dig organized by the Toronto Board of Education. The goal of the project was to give 1,800 school children a look at a city's history through the eyes of an archaeologist. Carolyn Smards headed the program.
We took a look first at the oldest school that the Toronto Board is currently owning, Sackville Street School, built in 1887, and found that it had been the home of somebody by the name of Thornton Blackburn. Now, we went through the city directories for the period to find out who Thornton Blackburn was, and in the 1846 directory, the line appeared, Thornton Blackburn, cabman, colored. And I hadn't known there were taxis in Toronto in the 1840s, and also was very interested in the fact that he was one of the city's black settlers, and continued with the research. When we found out who he was and who his wife was, where they'd come from, and the story of their lives, it was an absolute natural site for a public education project.
The couple who once lived at the site left no diaries or photographs. Almost 100 years after their deaths, all that remained of the Blackburns were the artifacts found at the Sackville Street site and a handful of public documents in Toronto and Detroit. But while there was little to work with, it was still enough. Put together, these remains told the story of a man and woman who escaped from slavery in the U.S. to prosperity in Canada, and in between found themselves the subjects of an international incident. A century after it ended, the Blackburn story could be told. When the archaeologists came to the site in the spring of 1985, their initial enthusiasm had little to do with Thornton and Lucy Blackburn's colorful past.
The educational potential of doing black heritage in the city, and also the research potential of excavating the first free black site ever dug in the province of Ontario. It all came together for us in the Thornton Blackburn house site.
From between the walls of the Blackburn house site, thousands of artifacts appeared, filling in the details of the couple's day-to-day life. For the archaeologist, it was an exciting time.
And when you find something, say a wine glass, you pick up out of one of the layers that correspond to the Blackburn. You hold this wine glass in your hand and you think, gee, the last person that probably toasted or drank out of this glass of wine was Thornton, maybe his wife Lucy. It's always exciting, pulling something up out of the ground and knowing you're the first person to touch it since it was dropped where it was, whether it was 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago.
But apart from the artifacts and a few records, a complete picture of the Blackburn story seemed out of reach.
And Thornton Blackburn could not read, nor could he write, neither could his wife Lucy. So we have no actual documents pertaining to Lucy and Thornton directly. There's no letters, there's no correspondence, for instance. It's very hard to pick up the threads.
Soon the threads came together in ways that surprised Smards. The student angle made the site a natural target for media attention. When this publicity happened to reach the United States, the early story of Thornton and Ruth, as Lucy was known in the South, came to the surface. As the story began for as many as 50,000 runaway slaves who came to Canada, U.S. scholars knew the Blackburn story had started on the Underground Railroad. Historian Reginald Larry.
The Underground Railroad consisted of different locations where slaves could go to get any kind of help that they might need. And oftentimes, a person would just give them some help, then they would become identified as part of that railroad. The code word was making free, that a black or a slave that was escaping would go to a plantation or go to a farm and knock on the door. And he said, well, I'm just making free. I'm just trying to get away. So it was just making free. I'm making free. You know, I'm trying to get free. And so it just became part of the dialogue, part of the language at that particular time.
After escaping their Kentucky masters, it took 2 weeks for the Blackburns to travel the 250 miles to Detroit, a city of 5,000 people, 1 in 10 were black. But while they had escaped slavery, they weren't yet free. Historian Norman McCrae.
Any free black who came into Michigan had to show his free papers and deposit $500 to ensure his good behavior and to guard against indigency.
Well, it was very dangerous. For example, that any black person who was walking down the street had to carry some form of a pass. If a white had any kind of identification, said that was a black had escaped, he was 5'11", he was light complected, he had brown hair, dark eyes, was wearing a jacket and a pair of pants, he could just walk along the street, and if he saw any black, he could take him by the arm and take him to the justice of the peace, and the justice of the peace or the judge could find the black as a fugitive.
2 years after arriving in Detroit, slave catchers found the Blackburns and had them arrested. In June of 1833, they waited in jail to be returned to Kentucky and slavery. The black community was outraged.
At first, they were going to try to break him out that original night, but then they decided that they would send 2 women to the jail to manage the escape of Mrs. Blackburn.
And on Sunday before they were going to leave on that Monday in June, a Mrs. Lightfoot and a Mrs. French came into the jail.
Mrs. French exchanged clothes with Mrs. Blackburn because they were approximately the same size and same complexion, and felt that the guard would not be able to see any difference in the 2 women. And that's what happened. She walked out of the jail as a free woman.
So on the day, the Monday, around 4 o'clock, Thornton Blackburn was supposed to be taken down to the foot of Woodward Avenue, where the boat sailed from, and taken by the steamship Ohio from Detroit to Cleveland, and then overland to Kentucky.
The sheriff had ordered Thornton to be brought up for his transfer. However, as the crowd moved in, the sheriff realized that maybe he shouldn't have done that, but the crowd moved in so fast.
Sheriff Wilson told his deputy not to let Thornton Blackburn come out until he had gotten the crowd back.
And Thornton, in the meantime, talks the deputy into letting him talk to the people, that he could possibly quiet them down because they were his friends and his associates, and he could probably talk to them, and they would leave.
And as he walked out, I'm telling you as best as I can put it together, and as he walked out, somebody slipped him a gun.
Once he pulls out the pistol, the crowd says, "Shoot the rascal."
Thornton fired, but hit no one. Thrown into a wagon, he was rushed to the river by men and women with names like Daddy Grace and Sleepy Polly. From there, he slipped across the river to Canada, where Ruth waited. Behind him, he left a city in chaos.
But back in Detroit, the word was out that the niggers have risen, and the whites went to the rescue of Sheriff Wilson and his deputy. Sheriff Wilson was almost killed. He was badly beaten. And all the blacks that they found on the street that night, any black, was put into the jail and incarcerated.
Blacks and whites at each other's throats, Michigan's 20-year-old acting governor had to move quickly. Immediately, he demanded the Blackburns' extradition.
Governor Mason was getting pressure from the people of Detroit because of the riot and what happened to Sheriff Wilson, and because of the whole issue of these inferiors, people thought to be inferior, creating such a mess in their city. It was a matter of pride, it's a matter of ego.
It looked as if Mason would get his way. Pursued by rumors of a sheriff's murder, the Blackburns went from Detroit's jail to a rocky reception on Canadian shores and found themselves behind bars again. On that same side of the river, it was now Lieutenant Governor John Colburn's job to decide the Blackburns' fate. Colburn governed a colony that was the first in the empire to legislate against slavery. It had done so through a delicate compromise that freed not a single slave, but assured the death of slavery by banning its importation and ordering that any child born to a slave woman be freed at 25.
So Canada became the Mecca for blacks escaping, because there they knew they were free.
But in 1833, the American extradition demands put this reputation to the test. Facing the Americans was John Colburn. An abolitionist, he had made his reputation 4 years before, writing to a group of Ohio blacks in need of help.
Tell the Republicans on your side of the line that we Royalists do not know men by their color. Should you come to us, you will be entitled to all the privileges of the rest of His Majesty's subjects.
On the Blackburn case, he was just as decisive.
The government at the time set a tone with their statement, stating that they would be as merciful and as compassionate as they could to the slaves coming in, and they would not, in principle, send them back unless there was a compelling, tremendous argument for it.
Canada was twitting, if you will, their American cousins' nose, because they had abrogated slavery, and Colburn, in his letter to Mason, said that we only extradite to the United States whenever it is a crime in Canada, and escaping from slavery is not a crime in Canada, so we have no constitutional or legal reasons to extradite these poor human beings.
The government of Upper Canada, led by Colburn, refused to extradite the Blackburns. 5 weeks after landing on Canadian soil, Thornton and Ruth were free. Within a year of their landing, the Blackburns traveled to Toronto.
Now, many blacks wanted to take an additional step. That was to move further inland, to escape slave catchers, because some were caught and some were smuggled back into the United States. And so what they wanted to do was, Thornton, Blackburn, and his wife Ruth, and many others, felt that they would be safer by going as far as Hamilton and Toronto from the nets of the slave catchers. They also felt that there was a thriving small black community here, which there was, a business community, a working community, and there were anti-slavery societies. The whole ambiance, the whole culture was built around protecting the refugees that were in Toronto. It was a very safe and very comfortable place to be.
More than 150 years after the Blackburns' arrival, Smards and the archaeologists dug into the foundation of a modern city to find out just how comfortable it had been. What their research turned up was that Thornton Blackburn, the ex-slave, was also an entrepreneur.
He sent to Montreal for the design for the Hackney cab and had one built in Toronto by a local locksmith and mechanic by the name of Paul Bishop. Painted the taxi red and yellow and named it the City, and operated the first cab company in Upper Canada.
The cab company a success, Thornton branched out into other enterprises. In 1852, he became vice president of the Canada Mill and Mercantile Company, which operated a grist mill and general store in the all-black community of Elgin.
I would say he was atypical. He was fortunate in the way that he had these qualities. He had you could say in the common vernacular, smarts, and he played upon that, and he did very well.
In the early 1860s, competition for the cab company moved into Toronto. But by then, the Blackburns were secure and established members of the community. However, south of the border, events would soon force Canada's ex-slave population to make a critical decision. The Civil War ended, and with it ended slavery. For the first time, thousands of ex-slaves in Canada could return south without fear. And while many seized the opportunity, the Blackburns were not among them.
There then was another class of blacks, another type of black who said, no, this country has been good to me. I want to stay. I want my children to stay here. I want to establish myself here. And so you got a class of blacks, businessmen and workers and others who did stay. I would say about 60% or so went back, and about 40 or fewer stayed here to state, to the country, their adopted country, which they love dearly.
Between about 1862 and 1890, I presume that Thornton was living as a retired person. And the name Thornton Blackburn appearing in the city directories at that time lists his occupation as gentleman.
Those that rose to the top, like in any society, were basically atypical. They were industrious, they were extremely bright, they were aggressive, and they had good health. And I think a combination of those factors, plus a general cultural affinity for refugees at that time, basically, particularly in Toronto, helped them.
As well off as the Blackburns were, the archaeological evidence has led Carolyn Smards to believe Thornton may have been something of a miser.
There's very little in the way of expensive ceramic remains left behind. That's the usual indicator, or the better quality dishes, bone china, porcelain, that sort of thing. Almost nothing. They were continuing to utilize the everyday wares that were sort of available to middle-income people in Toronto of the day, right through the end of their lives.
Thornton died in 1890 at the age of 76. Lucy died 5 years later. Ex-slaves, childless, and illiterate, they left estates valued at more than $17,000. In 1890, a small fortune. A few city blocks from their grave sites, children sifted through the remains of the Blackburns' home while the archaeologists pieced together their data, and they reflected on what kind of people Thornton and Lucy might have been.
When Thornton passed away, he passed away on February 26, 1890, Lucy almost immediately began negotiations with the Toronto Board of Education to sell the property to the Toronto Board to add to Sackville Street Schoolyard. I wonder which of the couple was the one who was so frugal. Either that, or there's a possible, I mean, this is all speculation because one cannot judge human emotions at this distance, but either that or she couldn't bear to be in that house without Thornton. They'd lived together there for nigh on 50 years. That's a long time. I don't know what the impetus was for the move, but certainly she left, and she moved into a better house than the one she had lived in.
And when you're working on someone like Thornton Blackburn, who after spending a bit of time and researching his past life, you feel like you've developed or you know a lot about the man, you know, the way he lived, where he came from, his goals, what he attained.
This would have been a very, at least in my own opinion, determined individual.
We found some interesting remains of wine glasses. So I guess, you know, we can say Thornton was drinking a bit of wine, maybe toasting the success of his taxi business.
You know, I think it would have been a very interesting individual to talk to.
There are sites all over Toronto. This city is a city within a city, if you want to think about it that way. And something like the Blackburn Project brings this to the public eye. We're the people who change the history books, those kids, and the archaeologists working with them.
The dig was completed in November of 1985. Smards and the archaeological team left the site, and the home of Thornton and Lucy Blackburn was covered over once again. In the spring, the children returned, not to a historical site, but to a schoolyard.